Japanese style gardens are becoming so popular. Good morning, Saj.
Hi, Fleur. How are you?
Good. But why do you think that is so? Why are Japanese gardens becoming just popular across many different countries?
It's a really good question, but I think it goes to that they can be applied to any size of garden, so large or small. And it's when you go into a garden, for me anyway, when I want to go into my garden, I want it to be a peaceful and, contemplative, reflective space. And that is what a Japanese garden is all about. So maybe other people are thinking the same way. What is it for you?
Yeah, I love that serenity that you get from the garden, and I think that really comes to a really strong design discipline that we'll talk today about restraint, because there's something that's just really deliberate about a Japanese garden. I think even though they're asymmetric in many ways, I think the orderliness of them is very tranquil, and really a lot of the time they're quite low maintenance, which I think appeals to a lot of people.
I think you're right. If you haven't noticed already, you're listening to the On Garden Design podcast with Fleur and Sachi, where we chat about what makes a garden great, and we try to inspire and make designing accessible to anyone who is interested in gardens. Your hosts are longtime friends Fleur and Sachi, who bring a fresh perspective and their life experience to designing gardens as a second career. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. We always put up some photos after our podcast. Follow us on Spotify so you know when the next episode is available. So let's go further into this Japanese garden design style.
Yeah.
So I think I want to caveat this right up front. There is, and we were just talking about this before we started recording, you could write a thesis on Japanese garden style. There is so much symbolism and tradition, and there are people who do this, as their career. We are not them. So this is all about how can you create a Japanese style garden.
Yeah, it's so important to put that up front, because it is a real art form, and a lot of designers are borrowing and leveraging off that art form, but we're not pretending to be Japanese here or have a deep understanding of the cultural influences that make a really proper Japanese garden.
Even though I have a Japanese name.
Yeah, go Sachi.
That's Sachi Corp for this for this episode.
And you know what? It means happiness, doesn't it?
It does mean happiness.
Yeah.
That's right. I had some pretty hippie parents back then. Just tells you what era I was born in, really. Anyway, back to the substance.
That's right. So let's have a look at the sort of what makes up a Japanese style garden. Well, we use the word Japanese style, and that's sort of Japanese inspired, Japanese fusion, Japanese influenced, but generally we want to describe what makes up the style of a Japanese garden.
I think the thing, as I said in the intro, is it's all about they strive to inspire peaceful contemplation. And so no matter how you put your garden together, that's the outcome you're aiming for if you want a Japanese style garden.
Yeah. And I think we might also get into some of the unpacking some of the representation side of it.
Yes.
So what does a Japanese garden kind of mean? We'll look at proportion, and we'll look at some of the natural textures as well. I think what's a really good way to start with sort of understanding Japanese gardens and how they're different to other Asian styles.
Good idea.
Yeah, let's have a look at, so Japanese gardens, they are a miniature representation of the Japanese landscape. So what I mean by that is, so all the elements that go into that garden, whether you're doing a little tiny courtyard or a much bigger garden, is that the elements are carefully selected and they're proportioned to that space that you have, which is why you can use them in a lot of different size gardens.
And the way I read that very neatly described for me is that they're created at the human scale, because there are very different Asian styles, and I think they get a bit blended in our new fusions that we seem to find certainly in Australia. So Balinese and Chinese gardens come to mind. So give us a bit of a theory lesson, Fleur.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think I'll focus, I think the biggest confusion is often between Japanese and Chinese gardens, because they're the ones you tend to see a lot of.
I'm sure Korean sits in there too somewhere, because it's probably also very closely related, but I don't know anything about Korean gardens.
Right.
So let's steer away from that.
That's right. Let's start with what we kind of know. So where Japanese gardens represent the landscape, Chinese gardens stylise the landscape. So let me give you kind of the difference of what that means. So this means that the Chinese gardens they use a different type of craftsmanship that manipulates the natural elements. And so I'll give you some examples.
Yeah, that would be useful.
So in the Japanese garden, boulders represent the sources of the river and the mountains. So the mountains, they represent the mountains. So in Japanese landscape, you have the mountainous areas, and that's where the river starts. So in the Chinese garden, they tend to create artificial rockeries that become vantage viewpoints. So it might be to sort of particularly elevate you, so you climb up around a large rockery area to get a view, and that view's deliberately framed either to take a middle distance or a borrowed view. Whereas in a Japanese garden that is human scaled, the rocks are there as a symbolic representation of mountains only, not to climb on, but to visualise. So that's the idea of the boulders. So then we have, of course, things like paths. So in the Chinese garden, the paths are deliberately inconsistent and zigzag. And this is all about representing the unpredictable passage of human life and also to provoke an experience. Whereas in the Japanese garden, the paths are about, they meander, but they're generally consistent. So they might be all a flagstone steppers or a gravel path, and they're about meandering for contemplation and reflection. So it's a different type of experience.
Interesting also, because I was reading about, because bridges often feature quite heavily in Japanese style gardens as well. They actually zigzag though across water too.
No, that's the Chinese version. So
Chinese that's interesting because someone got it wrong when I was reading, because what they actually said in Japanese, again, the symbolism, a straight bridge, maybe this is about a bridge across water as opposed to more like stepping stones or something, as opposed to a raised bridge. But they actually said straight lines. No, the Japanese garden used zigzag movement over water because evil spirits couldn't, they can only travel in straight lines, so you could leave the evil spirit behind, which is interesting. So who knows whether that was actually had any relevance at all.
Yeah, or maybe that's a source that has maybe
confused themselves with China.
Yeah, or maybe I'm confused, you know.
Well, I think this is the thing though. What that really represents is that there's a lot written about what a Japanese style garden is, and if you're going to be super true to a Japanese style garden, you need to do your research.
Yeah. So just a couple of other ones to pick up on is you often see the moon gates and picture windows in a Chinese garden, and that's about framing a certain view. And this is this manipulation and stylising of the landscape. However, in Japanese gardens, you don't see moon gates. Moon gates and picture windows. And also in the Japanese gardens, we have, they're very much like you mentioned before, the clipped trees and shrubs, and they are selected and shaped to be at that human level.
That's right, the human scale. Yeah. It's to stop them from growing big.
Yeah, and often in a Chinese garden, interestingly, is you'll see they'll leave a dead tree in there because that's a symbolism for the passing of time and where life goes and decay.
That's interesting.
But in a Japanese garden, you don't tend to see the dead trees.
You don't, but you do see they do embrace ageing. And a tree, an aged tree, again, has a lot of symbolism in a Japanese garden, but not necessarily a dead tree.
Yeah, and it has a lot of beauty too.
You've really got to consider what you want from your space in a Japanese gardens, because there are really two general categories of them. And one is it's a garden for walking and strolling, like you talked about before, the meandering paths and the things that slow you down to, be very much at one with your surroundings. The other one is it a garden to be looked at and a framed view? And it's really, of course I was picking up the little Japanese words that they throw in things, because apparently your garden, if it's a Japanese garden, should fit your kurashi, which means your ideal lifestyle. So you need to think about how you use a garden, and then you build your Japanese garden. Either is it framing a view or is it something to walk through and meander through?
Yeah, and that might be, dictated by, one, the size of your garden. Is it a courtyard garden? Or in one case, which I'm doing, in a garden in Canberra where the owner simply wants boxed views only 2 metres out from the windows. So when he's inside, he feels like he's in an entire Japanese landscape, but there's only 2 by 5 metre boxes of garden. So, and that's all about his, what was that Japanese word?
Kurashi.
Kurashi.
Yeah. Lifestyle, exactly.
Perfect, and it fits that perfectly. So I think, the size of the garden is a key, and also it's the experience you want to have. Are you going to be out in it, or are you going to be looking at it from inside?
Yeah, and I think, like with any garden, with the Japanese garden, again, Japanese gardens are very much integrated into the home. Like that flow and the connectivity with the house is very important too. And if you think about a lot of the Japanese architecture, it has floor-to-ceiling windows in the traditional architecture,
True.
which really brings the garden in from outside. So you want to be thinking, how does that work with what you've got in terms of your garden and house?
Yeah, that's
Connection.
so true. And the great thing about the Japanese gardens is you can really miniaturise it down to a small space
You can.
like that,
You can.
where you don't have to have a cascading stream through your garden. It could just be a water bowl.
That's right.
Because
And
that's all the space
in
you've
our
got.
drought-stricken country in Australia, a cascading stream is a bit of a dream for many. So let's talk a bit more about, because there's obviously and I'm sure, like everyone, when I think of a Japanese garden, often one of those things that comes into my head is the Zen garden, which is the gravel or sand garden with the strategically placed rocks or mountains, and the sand or the gravel is raked into those beautiful patterns, which symbolises the water. And I guess that to me is a very stylised Japanese garden and a very particular type of Japanese garden. So if you're into low maintenance and you like that very clean, pared back design aesthetic, a Zen garden might be the one that you want to look at, noting that you will have to weed gravel every now and then or sand, and you will have to also pick up things that fall into it.
So you need a blower.
You do, at least, unless you've got something that's going to blow the sand everywhere. You might end up with sandstorm.
But it's interesting because you really, even though it sounds like a simple design, there's so much in those Zen gardens.
Absolutely.
And I think this comes when you say, less is more. Now, when you've got less, you've got to be absolutely particular about the 5 items that go into that garden. 3 of those might be absolutely beautifully weathered rocks and boulders, and it's picking the rocks and having them laid in the right way is what's going to be pleasing in that design. If the whole focal point is the boulders, you've got to do them well.
And they've got to be the right type of rock as well. So if you get really into it, they actually use different types of rock to replicate different things. So, for instance, they will use flat rocks that rather something like something you walk across, and they represent islands or earth. And then rough volcanic rocks, like igneous rocks, will often be the ones that they use for the mountains.
Yeah.
So you want to be doing a bit of research and working out what your rock might be as well.
Well, go down to your local landscape yard and potter around and touch and feel and choose your rocks. I always say to my clients, let's go boulder shopping. Yeah. They're like, woohoo.
They're not cheap either, so you want to get the right rocks.
Well, they're not actually that expensive. You just basically drive your car through a weighbridge, put the rocks in the back and then drive off again.
That's if you're doing it.
I've bought lots of rocks like that.
I'm sure, but I wouldn't risk putting, because I've got some massive rocks in my front garden, which they're like an iceberg. They've been kind of buried in mulch now, so you can't see how big they are anymore. There's no way they would have fit in my car.
Oh, right, yeah.
They would have gone through it, in fact, I think.
Although, if you're looking at sort of a nice stylised small courtyard area, you could probably get the rocks.
Yes, true.
Well, it depends. Depends what your accessibility is.
Yeah, and I sort of one of the things that struck me is they tend to cluster their rocks as well. If they do cluster them, they are often quite solitary, but they will use multiples of 2 or 5 or 7. And I didn't quite get to the bottom of why. And
2.
apparently, 2, which is very unusual because we always talk about 3s.
Yes.
We talk about odd numbers
Yes.
in design generally, but they do talk about 2. And they did also talk about random placement can represent spontaneity.
I like that.
I do too.
And also the fact that if you're looking at something that's randomly placed, you stop and you register that.
You do.
You think, why is that so?
That is true. That is true.
And that's making that whole kind of contemplative, in the moment, mindful experience.
And of course, I got a silly analogy in my head straight away. You know, when someone in your family just leaves a random shoe sitting in the middle of the floor, and you always stop and you think, how did that get there?
And why is there one?
Same principle. That's right.
There you go. So we've sort of looked at really the components and some of the ways that you see Japanese gardens designed. What else do we want to put in a garden? Like if we're doing a home garden here and we want to do Japanese style, what are some other things we want to include there?
So I think obviously the water piece is important in a Japanese garden, and if you're lucky enough to have a stream flowing through your property, that is obviously a key thing, if you can manage it. But often traditional gardens will have asymmetric ponds. The still water is also that contemplative and reflective element, and I guess the symbolism is that water is a reflection of life. And so you do want to think about where you might place some water in your Japanese garden if you are a water-loving person, because obviously it's not for everyone. And if you have a Zen garden, water doesn't really fit.
Yeah. And I think in those Zen gardens, the raking of the beautiful circular raking actually symbolises the flow of water.
It does. It symbolises water. Interestingly, just to completely digress slightly, but the Zen monks that's where the Zen gardens come from originally, and they used to maintain those gardens. And the maintenance was very important because it was the care with which they tended the garden was part of their mind training and practice in humility.
Well, that would be very humbling, spending hours and hours all day raking the beautiful...
It would. I was thinking it'd be an excellent job for the kids. A bit of,
to improve their attention span
mind
off
training
TikTok.
and humility.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, yeah, just to be able to focus on one thing for more than a few minutes.
Exactly.
There you go. That's what we need. We all need a Zen garden.
We do. So what are you thinking about when you're thinking about the other components of a Japanese garden?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about some of the materials that we use. So we talked a lot about boulders. We talked a bit about water. But I also want to talk about using contrasting pebble and rock. And so sometimes if you're not in a position to manage water in your garden, you can insinuate water by using a different colour or different shaped pebble. So I sometimes use like steel edging to give really crisp, clean edges between different pebbles or different surface finishes. And so sometimes you can have like quite a limestone jaggedy type of white pebble, and then it contrasts really nicely with a dark black volcanic type of rounded pebble. So you've got these contrasts in the textures that are really pleasing, and you use those for that kind of sensory stimulus that's just about texture. And that's where sometimes when you've got nothing else but deliberate restraint, so no plantings and no clutter, but just the space, and you're using textures on the surface, that is stimulating enough in itself.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to that restraint. You don't want to do it a lot, and texture restraint is also important in a Japanese garden. But I think you're right. You can get some really nice movement as well if you have some curves with your edging between those pebble types or that surface type, whatever it might be, even the sort of a grass to gravel or a grass to pebble or whatever it might be.
Yeah,
thinking
certainly
about the flow.
Yeah. And the other things are sort of some of the accessories that you typically see. So you'll often see a lantern in a Japanese garden, and that's often near a path or a seat. And it's all part of that symbology of reflection and contemplation. So the seat is the invitation to stop and meditate, and having a lantern there is a point of focus. So that's right. Often a beautiful and a very accessible accessory to put into a Japanese garden. It's very symbolic, and it's very recognisable as a feature.
It is, and I think again we have to go back to this critical element of what makes a Japanese garden. You're aiming to create a scene where no one part overpowers another. So you do want to avoid sort of that wildly contrasting textures and colours that's in your hardscapes and your materials. You want to try and get some harmony in what you're doing. So if you are thinking about, I want a seat and a lantern nearby, you want to make sure that you're thinking about how they work together and that unity that you bring into your scene. And really, less is more.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's really important, actually, that we should reflect on in a Japanese garden, empty space is good.
Yes.
Because I think we have a predisposition that we want to fill all those gaps in the garden. You don't want space between your plants. But actually in Japanese gardens, they aim to have space because space is an important part. And it also, with the plants, if you have space between the plants, it allows the plant to be its own star and to evolve and grow as it is intended. And nothing else is taking away from it.
Yeah, it's so true. The space is actually a celebrated part of a Japanese garden. It's Really important. And I find, as a designer, I find it quite an exercise in restraint. I've really got to hold myself back, not putting too many plants in.
Yes, because it is our default.
Yes.
Because we're always, and I think it's partly, certainly what's in my mind is, I've either got mulch, but I do want plants growing because I want to stop the weeds. So Japanese gardens, you need to be thinking about how you're going to manage that as well. I think that's really important. The other concept in a Japanese garden, and I have to use this one because I really like these little Japanese words that, they're not little Japanese words, they're Japanese words, or concepts that they come up with. But the other thing that they do embrace is the beauty of imperfection. And that's actually got a name. It's called the concept of wabi-sabi.
Wabi-sabi sachi.
Wabi-sabi, exactly, that's right. I think that's what I'm going to be throwing around at home for a bit.
Yes.
But it's all about allowing your plants and materials to age gracefully so that they get that unique organic patina and feel with age, which goes to that representation of time.
Yeah.
Because Japanese gardens are not a thing, they're not a flash in the pan, they're there for a long time.
And that's where this is really a space where you have to have natural rock, natural stone,
no plastic
natural materials, no plastic, no concrete and no composite timbers or any of that. It needs to be really aged and weathered type of natural stones.
Materials,
yeah.
Absolutely. The other thing I really would like to talk about, because we've been talking about a lot about the design aesthetic, which is subtlety, as we've been talking about, and deliberate sparing use of things. But the other thing is that seasonality is really important in these gardens. So before we talk about the plants that you might use, maybe just a bit of a conversation. So really the goal is you want an appropriate sort of colour and texture display which works for each season, because time again is represented through the seasons.
Yes.
And so just to give you an example, you wouldn't include a red foliage plant in a Japanese gardens during the growing season, which is spring. What you would be looking for is trying to get that seasonal colour red in your autumn part of, that autumn season in your Japanese garden.
Which is why, of course, your maples is such a
go-to. That's right.
Go-to plant for a Japanese garden.
That's exactly right. So just to give some more sort of practical examples. So spring is symbolic of rebirth. Uh-huh. And so deciduous plants that go directly to leaf are usually featured, and also if they flower. So that's usually one of the one times you find the blossom. And summer is actually about green. It's not about lots of flowering and, that sort of stuff that we favour in Australia, certainly, that flowering shrubs and perennials, that's not part of it. It's all about the green in summer. And then autumn is obviously,
the colour.
Yeah, the colour, exactly. And that works in the Northern Hemisphere because, actually it works in Australia as well. No.
So how much evergreen should you have in a Japanese garden?
Well, it's a real staple. Japanese gardens are not flower gardens. They are absolutely based on their foliage framework.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'd also say the structural element that a tree gives you. And, Japanese, like we were talking before, that scaling element, you want your landscape to be at the human scale. So no big shade trees.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of the Japanese, growth forms look very manipulated, because it's actually about keeping your trees and your larger plants at a scale that is a human size scale.
And that's where the little conifers, dwarf conifers that grow.
See, now we're in the plants. We can't help ourselves.
But that's good. We should be in plants right now.
We should.
And so the dwarf conifers are just gorgeous, because if you clip out some of the centre part and just expose the trunk and sort of cloud prune those, they can just look absolutely gorgeous. And that's not a really intense skill. That's quite
No, it's
lovely.
not. But you do have to start exactly. You have to start early and know what you're doing as well. Cloud pruning is absolutely one of those Japanese things. So what other plants would you be thinking about if you were doing a Japanese garden?
Well, I want to talk about some of the gardens I've done, because they've all been, the plant choices have come well and truly after the hardscaping arrangements. And so I want to sort of put it out there, because we have listeners in almost 40 countries now, that the choice of plant is about its sculptural and its performance element, as you just highlighted in the seasonality, rather than the plant itself.
Yes, and I think that's a really good point. Japanese gardens are not about Japanese plants.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And actually, let me talk straight about Barbara and Alan's garden, which is in Canberra. It's we get hot summers, dry, and very cold winters. So it was about plant choice that was going to honour their west-facing garden.
So west for us is where the sun is hitting in the afternoon and just crispifying everything.
And that would be west for everybody in the world.
It would. Strange that.
That's right. So west is a harsh sun in Canberra. And so what we've done, instead of what you might otherwise choose as maples in the woodland part of the garden, we've used the Australian grass tree.
Yes, which is very sculptural.
Beautifully sculptural. Gorgeous, and you 3 different heights, 3 different trees. They look absolutely stunning.
Slow growing, so they're not going to get too big out of your human scale.
Yeah. And then in an area where you might, you need some more architectural form that has that impact of a bit of a flower, interesting one, is a kangaroo paw. That's another Australian take, which looks so good in a Japanese-style garden.
It does, absolutely. And I think they are a really good use of the texture as well that is so important here. So, as Fleur said, the conifers are really good because they've got a very different texture. But also thinking about, actually, the pines, they represent longevity as well. I just thought I'd throw that in because that's a nice one to think about.
They last a long time.
They do last a long
unless
time.
Unless there's a fire.
Yeah, that's right. So you really are thinking about your azaleas and your camellias and your maples, which you might, you often go to as your Japanese sort of type plants, but they are used with restraint because they are flowering plants. You really want to use them for the sole purpose of marking your seasonal change.
And one more one, which is great for those who are in really harsh climates, is it's an Australian plant, the scleranthus.
Oh, I was going to mention that too, yes.
And it's just this wonderful little, it looks like a little grassy moundy type of, not grass, it looks like
moss.
It looks like moss,
yeah.
But it's full sun, drought hardy. And
it's super lush looking.
It's lush, and it's sort of surprising because you think, oh gosh, it looks like moss, but we can get away with that in full sun here. So it's a really great alternative. You put, particularly, it sort of kind of drapes itself over the rock. So if you put that near the base of your mountain area, it's kind of this moss that's coming off the mountains.
That's right. And moss is very big in Japanese gardens. They've obviously got quite a different climate to us here.
Yeah.
So you're looking for that cool, green, tranquil areas, which goes to that contemplative thought. And so scleranthus is a great one. The other one that I think is quite useful for Australia as well, because it's hardy, is mondo grass, the dwarf mondo grass.
Yeah.
Because you can also use that to create a bit of a lush. Very, I don't know that you could flush it actually, but
it could be lush in places. Yeah,
exactly that very lush green, and it always looks like it's sort of very, I guess,
it's tough,
fresh and new.
Yeah, it's really
that's
tough.
right. And the other one is bamboo. Because that's pretty tough as well. Not as tough as some of the others, but useful for screening. You want to use the clumping version of bamboo as well. It's quite ornamental, and it can be an important structural component as well when you're looking for that texture difference.
Yeah, so I think the key thing here is, so we talked about some of the sort of more classics, like the I guess cycads, you talked about azaleas, camellias. There's just respond to the environment that you have in terms of plants. So choose the plants according to their seasonality, their architectural form, not necessarily the Japanese plants. And actually, I went to a terrific garden in New Zealand called Moritaki, and it's all done with New Zealand natives, and it is a Japanese fusion garden. And what made it Japanese style was that the structure was really recognisable. So it had a flowing stream from the mountains, which were the boulders. It had a lot of gravel, like a big riverbeds sort of done in gravel, textured wood and stone steppers, a little bridge, which sort of and a slow pond. And so the important part is the symbolism or the representation of the landscape was 100% Japanese identifiable, but the plants were all New Zealand natives.
Fantastic.
And so, it was just well balanced and it responded to the environment. So I think that really worked.
I think that's really important. And in fact, I was thinking about how could you create, if you have very limited space, you could actually do something that almost represents the seasonality and a Japanese garden. You could have a single cherry tree to announce spring. You could have a potted azalea as your summer. That's bringing that early summer, and then the fiery changing leaf colour in autumn.
Yeah.
If you have each of those things, you're starting to get the foundations of what's in a Japanese garden.
Yeah, and then a good gravel mulch.
And a good gravel mulch, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So Any takeaways from this one, Flo?
Yeah, I'd have to say, so the top ones to think about is the representation. And when I say representation, I talk about the elements you put in your garden that represent a miniature Japanese landscape. That's sort of number one. The proportion, and that is looking at the size and scale, like you talked about, the height of trees being quite low, and the using the void spaces, the open spaces balanced against the planted spaces. And the last one is natural textures. It's all about the patina, natural stone. So they're my top three.
I'm going to add one last thing before we wrap up. And for me, it's less is more. Be restrained with all of the things that we've just talked about.
Yeah. And so I think it's very doable for a lot of our listeners. And I hope you have a great journey putting together your own Japanese garden. Send us some photos.
That would be great.
And we'll post photos of the gardens I've just talked about as well.
We will indeed. So we will talk to you again soon. And in the meantime, follow us on Instagram, find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to have you listening to us again. Talk to you later.
Next time.
Bye.